was telling Andrew I'll have to hire him out to do my bios in the future. That woman sounds much more impressive than what we might talk about today. But Dean Chang, Andrew, thank you for allowing Google and myself to be here today. I want to also recognize we have some fellow Googlers in the crowd and good friends in our partner network. So it takes an ecosystem to do this work together. But before I officially talk about the work we're doing and our call to action, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the place and time that we're in. All of us come to this moment today from very different perspectives, right? We have researchers, we have engineers. I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do better as a recovering lawyer. We have young people, but all of us are two things. We are innovators and we are placemakers. And if there's ever a time in human history, and especially in the United States, to talk about placemaking, I think the time is now. Because the fabric of a lot of the communities that we're trying to build is fraying for a variety of reasons. But it's not for lack of trying. And so my challenge to us today is I think that we can come from a place of abundance, an idea of access, that transportation is justice and freedom, and it takes the intersection of that ideology, technology, and innovation to get there. So, mind you, I'm reframing all of us as placemakers and innovators who together can weave this fabric of transportation access and abundance. And as Ezra Klein notes, abundance is this idea that in the transportation sector, everyone should have access. And that is a vision that Google founded almost 28 years ago. I want to just take a moment because too often in these conversations we talk very in the weeds about engineering concepts, architectures, ideas of technology, how it's been deployed, but we don't take a 10,000 or 100,000 foot view to ask, what is the vision we are trying to achieve? And I just want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but think rhetorically, can you recite the vision of your organization offhand? Likely it's just maybe words on walls. Maybe it's a few values. I applaud Andrew and the program for starting with the values and the vision for CS3, but too often we aren't asking, what is our moonshot? So again, at Google, a company that I joined about 14 months ago, we always start conversations with what is our vision. And as you see that here, it's really just to give the world information as quickly as they can get there. Because abundance isn't just about having access, it's about knowing how to get access, right? How do I get to the next train? And mind you, I was in Minnesota for 15 years and I still cannot figure out how to navigate the New York trains after a snowstorm. How do we do that together with technology and innovation? It takes information and access. And so I challenge you throughout today's conversations in the coming weeks and months, ask yourself what your vision is. Because in Google and at the Transportation Board annual meeting, which is one of the largest research conferences in transportation, several weeks ago, we asked this question. We had a moonshot in the 1960s. Why haven't we achieved our moonshot that Dean Chang and Andrew referenced yet? Because it only took 8 years from John F. Kennedy, the then president, to identify a goal of putting a human on the moon and Neil Armstrong moonwalking. And that was before geospatial positioning, the internet, the IoT, smart city concepts, the advent of generative artificial intelligence. So I'm going to challenge us in today's conversation to really think about what is our moonshot vision and what it will actually take to get there. Well, I really want to talk about what taking action looks like. Taking action can look like a few different things, and I'm actually going to ask you, if you are physically able, to maybe raise your hand if any of these questions resonate with you. And Andrew, you hinted at this, but I'm curious if there's anyone in this room who's ever been frustrated by a technology company that was building a product in this space, but it wasn't really delivering what you needed. Look around. It's hard to see behind us, but most hands are raised. Okay, raise your hand again if you're able. If you've ever felt research needed to get outside the academic halls, outside of the labs, and be deployed and tested in the real-world environment. If there's anyone whose hand isn't raised, I'm gonna, maybe just question why we're here today. And third, raise your hand if you feel that there has been a gap between private sector innovation, public sector mission, and research ideas. That is why we're convened here today, right? And that is why CS3 exists. That's why NSF funds this work, and that is why Google and Google Public Sector was founded. It was founded a little over 3 years ago with this idea that, as many of you may have heard yesterday, Google is now a $400 billion market capitalized company. It is number 2 in the world now, only to NVIDIA. And what we believe is we should be using that power for good. We should be using private innovation for public sector mission, and we need all of you to get there. Many of us raised our hands with those 3 questions. I believe the people in this room can make sure that in the coming years, we don't have to have those gaps in innovation and technology. And so I just want to tell a little bit about my story, how I chose to take action. So as Andrew noted, I've been at all levels of government at the intersection of public policy and innovation. Federal government, White House, US Department of Transportation, nonprofits, state government, city government. And every time I was in those roles, I kept thinking, gosh, the private sector is just not delivering on this promise, whether it's artificial intelligence or any of the other technologies we tried to build, such as connected vehicle ecosystems to save lives, or autonomous vehicle engagements with Waymo and Zoox. Every time as a public sector leader, investor, researcher, I would say, you're just kind of missing the mark, folks. And a mentor of mine said, well, Kristin, those who can should, and if you're critiquing, maybe you should become part of the problem that you say is the problem. So when Google reached out a little over 2 years ago, I was really skeptical. I wasn't convinced the private sector could solve this gap, even as NVIDIA and Microsoft and OpenAI and Google were in this space race of AI. But I said, it takes an ecosystem to do this, and I want to do this together. And so what does action look like? Well, many of us, after we have a vision, we need a strategy, because hope without a plan, as my colleague who used to lead the Department of Energy said, is just a dream. We need tactical strategies. And so at Google, over the past 14 months, we went to convenings like this. We interviewed academics. We hosted roundtables. We met with partners in the private information ecosystem. And we came up with a strategy to get to our moonshot. A moonshot where transportation technology is accessible to all and it serves a public mission. And these are the 5 focus areas we talked about. Now, this might not resonate with your strategy, but I want to share a little bit about why we centered on these conversations. First, and I already referenced, is when you're not looking at the vision and mission and the end in mind, that moonshot, we sometimes lose our way. And more importantly, at these institutions in Silicon Valley, when they don't know the transportation mission and Vision Zero moonshot, they are not building towards that. They're engineering solutions that, as I noted, maybe miss the mark a little bit. But 2, and this is a really important challenge for a recovering lawyer and someone who's had to learn about engineering and these policies, sometimes we don't use plain enough language. And what I mean by that is for those of us who are in the plain language space, meaning lawyers or people who write policy documents in the public sector, plain language is defined as the 7th grade reading level. What that means is when I'm trying to tell my nephew Lauren, who loves transportation and thinks I actually drive a snowplow, but nonetheless, I'm trying to help explain what I do in artificial intelligence innovation to a 7th grader. Because when we're not thinking about that, when our conversations are either too technical or too high level, we are talking past each other and not with each other. And that's why we're seeing such a disconnect across the private research and public ecosystems. We need to be using plain language. Third is we need to rely on our partners, and I really applaud CS3. Andrew, you had a great image of all the partners you bring to the table across public and private sector ecosystems. Many of you don't know that at Google, our products, 85% of them are built with partners. We cannot go it alone. And in fact, even if we could, we recognize we shouldn't, because we might not have all the answers. And so I encourage you to think about that in your own work and continue to grow your networking connections, which is, again, why we host convenings like this. 4th, human-centered design. Has anyone in this room, and this is a rhetorical question, ever had a conversation where you thought, we're talking about technology and innovation, but are we actually solving for the problems that our communities experience? Are we placing humans at the heart of problem solving? And as someone who's steeped in human-centered design, a concept that originated out of Silicon Valley and Stanford in the 60s, design thinking, we call it, starts with one first fundamental principle, which I want to share with you because it resonates. The first step to human-centered design and design thinking, to place humans at the heart of the problem, is empathetic inquiry. What is that mom dealing with as she's holding her stroller trying to get down on the T and the elevator's broken? What is it like for my 80-year-old father to get around to his medical appointments when he's immobile? What does it mean to be a young 16-year-old having to travel from Florida to pitch to this group? What is their lived experience? Have we thought about that enough? And lastly, that means we need to prioritize this work. And that's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit of our remaining time. So at Google, when I started there 14 months ago, they asked me to review all of the different artificial intelligence and other solutions that we'd built over the last 5 years. And I can tell you, I took some time. Google's a big company, 170,000 people. And I started to do an analysis. It took me months. And finally, I was able to create a list of all the different applications. It wasn't 50, it wasn't 100, it wasn't even 200. It was 412 different applications. Can you imagine being a public sector, public works director, a city official, a state Department of Transportation planner, and having to navigate 400 different options to help them? It's untenable. And so that is why we realized we had to prioritize our work ruthlessly, which is another reminder that if you're prioritizing too much, it's the same as having no priorities, which is why we started with Google for Transportation, which was launched this year at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting and now available on our website. We realized that many of these problem statements are not unfamiliar. They're very familiar. And you'll see actually some synergies with the impact areas that Andrew noted in his opening presentation. We believe that artificial intelligence, technology applications that Google develops and will be developing in partnership with you all, needs to be focusing on these 4 key areas: safety, resiliency, operations, and planning. These are not new areas of impact to our public sector colleagues and the people who live this work every day, but these are new domain areas to the engineers working in Silicon Valley, which is why they are now hiring people like me, and hopefully someday people like you all, because in the future, we're not just going to be civil engineers, we are going to be prompt engineers. And what I mean by that is we need to ensure that this transportation community preserves our domain expertise so we can teach the engineers who don't understand our industry and transportation what we should be developing. A good example of this is my first month at Google. We were developing or thinking about a product called Roads Management Insights. And our brilliant product lead, a brilliant engineer who's traveled the globe for Google, sat down and asked me, what if, because we like to start conversations with ideation, what if we could use all of our Google Maps, Waze, and Android Auto data, which can cover anywhere from 60 to 90% of any one community, and tell public agencies where travelers were in real time or in a predictive way? Would that be helpful? Now, I almost laughed to our brilliant engineer because I thought this is a perennial problem we've been talking about in our industry, about where people are moving, how we can predict where they're traveling, ensuring we know what speeds they're going, where they're coming from, where they're going to. And yet it took just a simple conversation with a transportation passionate expert and a Google engineer to make sure that that innovation came to life. And that's just one example in the story of all these different vertical solutions. Now, I'm sure all of you have your own product roadmaps, but this is a reminder that we need to together collaboratively be working in these opportunities together. Because we need to harness, as Andrew and Dean Chang noted, the value of private sector innovation. Because as my good friend Dara Wheeler, who just retired as the chief AI architect and leader at Caltrans, reminds us, research brings the ideas, public sector brings the mission, and private sector can bring the solutions and de-risk it for all of us. And I'll give another 2 examples before I move on. Resiliency is not anything new to many communities, especially in the Northeast, especially in New York. We have survived hurricanes in this area, major climate events. Now, as acting administrator for the Federal Highway Administration, I was responsible for the administration's response to Hurricanes Helene and Milton last fall, September, October of last year. For those who might need a reminder on what happened, it was the single largest emergency event the American public had ever seen. $8 billion in recovery that will take a century to overcome because we had less than 24 hours notice that that hurricane would move from Florida and Georgia into Tennessee and the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. And we had less than 24 hours notice with weather data that would happen. 2 months after starting at Google, we worked with our Earth AI team looking at the data and satellite imagery and the algorithms with artificial intelligence that had been developed 6 months before. And we realized we could now predict those weather events 5 days in advance. 273 lives would have been saved. So when I talk about our vision and moonshot and pairing it to these tactical strategies, I'm talking about real lives. And that, my friends, is how I want to close this out. I want to close this out with a call to action. When I talk about saving real lives, that is a story that resonates with us. All of us are brilliant researchers, academic leaders, but we aren't always focusing on the story that compels us to work together. Yes, we can share statistics about the number of lives saved with some of the connected vehicle technologies and artificial intelligence that we're deploying in Caltrans to predict where crashes are. I can say to you, yes, we're now identifying 30% more of the crashes in California with our AI, but that's not the story. So I want to share my story and offer you to think about your transportation story, to be vulnerable and share why you're a part of this collective mission. My story started when my dad was 20, and in South Dakota, a very rural state, he lost his father, Whizzer White, yes, that's his name actually, in a car crash where technologies that I just mentioned would have saved his life. I'm galvanized by that story because that's why I'm here. I didn't know my paternal grandfather, but every single day, week, month, we had conversations about what if we had something to keep him alive and here at the dinner table. Each of us has a story that galvanizes us to do this work. I encourage you to tell it. We pair the data with the story. 2 is we break down partner silos, and I really applaud you, Andrew, and the entire team here. You're bringing together an ecosystem because we know we cannot go this alone. If you want to become a partner of Google, here's a little plug. We encourage you to do so, and I'll give you some information, but I do encourage you, if you are doing work, you should at least have a connection in all 3 sectors, research, private sector, and public sector. Make sure you're building that ecosystem. 3rd is I would encourage us to focus on outcomes, not outputs. Now, in this industry, many of us have different KPIs, key performance indicators, like number of lane miles installed. When I was at the federal government and the Minnesota State Department of Transportation, we would have a long list of metrics, such as the number of traffic signals upgraded, the number of pavement line miles upgraded, the number and amount of guardrail that we installed. But the public and our communities don't care about spreadsheets and data. They care about how it's helping them. So I want to encourage us to think about more results-based accountability and outcomes-based models. Mark Friedman is someone who I greatly admired from the organization called Clear Impact, former Government Accountability Office leader who said at the federal government at that time, why are we measuring outputs, not outcomes? Why aren't we asking the question after and during every project milestone, is anyone better off? Why aren't we asking questions about transportation abundance like, did they feel safe? How safe did they feel? How affordable was it? What prevented them from accessing transportation affordably and seamlessly? Those are the metrics I hope we work on. That is something I would love all of you to help me with in this research and partner ecosystem because it's something that Google is really dedicated to. And lastly, I will encourage you to join our movement. I hope that you will reach out to Google or a private sector entity, there's some great ones here today, so that we can bridge this partnership between public need, private innovation, and academic research. And I want to just finish with a couple closing thoughts. One of my favorite researchers, a good friend and mentor, her name is Yingling Fan. She works for the University of Minnesota. Again, I'm a little bit beholden to the state of Minnesota for a variety of reasons, but it's helped launch my career. And one time she sat me down and she said, Kristin, why aren't we talking about happiness? And I was like, oh, you mean as friends, right? She's like, no, in our professional careers. She started research at the University of Minnesota with the intersection of transportation and happiness. Her research now shows, and it's on her website, that when we give more affordable, seamless, reliable transportation, including, of course, public transportation, people actually show and report a statistically significant increase in their levels of happiness. Now, how many of you thought that you would come to a conference today and talk about happiness in transportation? But I want to remind you that we're all placemakers and catalysts who can actually, in our careers, bring people joy and make them happier. And what a noble cause as placemakers. So I hope you will join our movement. I hope you will reach out to myself, to our website. We have a new chatbot on our new website where you can offer ideas on what companies like Google should be doing. I encourage you to use it. Take down the names and contact information of people you're meeting today and reach out to them. I hope you will remember to remain mission-driven, to drive your own strategy and build your own partnerships. And I will close with this as we entertain the remainder of our fireside chats, pitch startups, and other keynote panels and sessions today. I will end with this. The future is not something that happens to us. We are all catalysts that can be galvanized to act and shape it. And we must do it together. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for your very inspirational kickoff talk. So really appreciate that, and also great to see the alignment at Google and some of the things that we hold dear. You know, I had some questions prepared, and I think that actually your address addressed many of those. So let me just jump right into the heart of some of the things that people might be asking themselves. So when working with the public sector, there are always going to be questions about data quality, data ownership, and risk ownership. And I'm just wondering how, I think I can see some elements of it. I think you said, let's start with something, a few applications, and effectively build trust. I'm wondering what the thinking is around that and the balance of protecting information, you know, people's identities, all of those kind of things, but nevertheless the need to share data openly with the public sector.
Oh, I love that. And it's a perennial question, right, Andrew, about trusting conversations between public and private sectors. And I include academia in that, right? So the first thing I would offer is I think we should all be skeptics, right? Use our critical thinking skills. And I have a friend in the audience who I'm not going to name. We've had this conversation about sometimes, because the private sector is for profit, they're just trying to sell something. And they don't always deliver on what they're selling and marketing. And again, that's another reason why I wanted to join the private sector, Andrew, because I was so frustrated with what we would often in my industry colleagues call vaporware. They would sell you something, but it would kind of erode into the vapor. It wouldn't really exist. And it was so frustrating. So the first is make sure you are asking those questions, right? And I'd love to partner. You know, we have a list of questions that I encourage colleagues to ask. You mentioned a couple of them, like, how are you managing data? What is your data quality? For those of us in the data and AI world, there's a wonderful organization called the Data and Trusted AI Alliance. They are the foremost global leaders on how you talk about data. What is data provenance? Where did it originate from? How are you protecting privacy? How are you keeping that information accurate? For our artificial intelligence models, for example, I mentioned one with California. Our model has an algorithm that shows you can trust this X%. Like, oh, we actually only got 30% of last month's crash data, which means you can only trust this information about 15%. You need more data to have more reliability of the information you're seeing. The second thing I would offer, Andrew, and again, as a recovering lawyer, I wish there were more lawyers of us in these conversations, because one of the reasons I also wanted to join the U.S. Department of Transportation as chief counsel is lawyers can be part of the problem. I'm sorry, friends. We are too risk averse, but we actually should be harnessing risk. And for those of you that are working with in-house counsels, what I always talk in our legal community, at TRB we have a whole legal workshop and section, is an in-house counselor is there to advise you, but you then ultimately get to make the decision. And a good lawyer will tell you that. But too often I've seen lawyers either say, nope, we can't do that. Nope, we can't do that. That's too much of a risk. And that's for you as critical thinkers to say, why? Why is that happening? Because that's honestly, I think, one of the biggest reasons why government procurement is so behind. And that's the last thing I would say, Andrew, before maybe entertaining another question is, has anyone ever here heard of Martech's law? Any? Right, okay, so I have a new friend now. Martech's law is, I just learned it this year, in the last year, is this ideology or idea that while technology expands exponentially, AI is actually now doubling in speed every 3 months, that our organizations and public institutions only evolve logarithmically. And think about it. If you think about transportation agencies, road departments, highways, public works departments, they were evolved to manage and build concrete and steel. They have never been evolved or supported or, internally organized to build and scale and acquire artificial intelligence and software and acquire data. And so it's our job as a coalition to do several things. Well, one thing we're doing at Google is building a capability maturity model. Maybe, Andrew, it's something we can partner on, which is here's the 7 things you need to go from an agency who's never even thought about this to the most efficient agency in the world. And that's including things like having a vision, having a champion, an executive champion who can organize and galvanize the team, having a strategic roadmap for that, allocating funding, updating your procurement methodologies to be more outcomes focused, like I talked about a little bit, making sure you start to have a prioritized pilots and use cases and have very good, strong outcomes-based metrics to evaluate that. That was very fast, Andrew, but I'm excited to hear what else we have to talk about.
That's actually a perfect segue into my next question. And I've had this experience working a lot with public agencies. I have a feeling, and I hear it a lot, that they're paralyzed by vendor lock, basically. And I'm sure you have this, having come from the government side over to the private side, I'd say you have a lot of insight into this as well. But they don't want to, own a system that's going to be obsolete. So I'm wondering, as a partner now on the industry side, if you have ideas of new models for procurement that, afford cities sort of an agility rather than getting stuck with a product that is obsolete in a few years.
And this is a huge passion of mine. Maybe we need like a procurement technology wonks, organization, because I think that is a huge opportunity and arguably one of the single biggest catalysts to driving technology innovation for public good. So 2 great institutes, one you're already partnering with, Future Today's Institute. I haven't actually worked with them directly, but for those, in the cities arena, there's opportunities for shared procurements, which is so important because if one agency or city's lawyers are preventing them from acquiring something, they can be part of a shared procurement to get them from somewhere else. That should be a national model. 2 is the National Association of State Procurement Officials, known as NASPO. We worked with them about a decade ago when our program started because we developed what we called an open, rolling, outcomes-based solicitation, meaning we had just a list of problem statements, and so we offered the industry, we have money. If you think you can solve one of these and have some clear outcomes, we will pay you to do that. And NASPO really evangelizes that type of work. I would love to see more work. I think research institutions could learn how private sector is challenged with public government innovation and help build some of these templates for better specifications, better procurement. I know it's not the sexiest thing, and I can't imagine a lot of grad students wanting to do that. But friends, I will be your friend and mentor if that's something you want to do, and I really think we need to be focusing on that.
So I have 2 quick questions then. I guess the first is on business models and how, what's in it for the public sector and how they can finance basically the infrastructure. And the second question, maybe you can take them in whatever order you like. Obviously, we're here with lots of researchers, students. I'm wondering if there's any non-technical piece of advice that you would give them that maybe they're underestimating as they are developing their technologies and rolling them out. So 2 very different questions. So business models and then insights into maybe things that I might think are important, but from your experience, I think you probably have a much better view into that.
Okay, first of all, this is why I love a fireside chat, because it's not canned, it's not like a bunch of remarks. Like, I love that second question, Andrew, and I want to start with that. And I've been thinking about this a lot. So I moved, when I went to Google, I left Washington, D.C. and moved to Silicon Valley. And what I realized more recently is environment really does change you. I mean, one, I'm happier in the sunny California sunshine, but in Silicon Valley, everyone is brainstorming, constantly ideating. You've got Post-it notes everywhere. You've got these whiteboards. And I was reminded that we fail to actually just think different. We fail to brainstorm. And isn't that kind of sad? A friend at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting reminded me, Kristin, the last time we actually innovated transportation in a national way was when Eisenhower funded the interstate system. We haven't incrementally really transformed transportation since then. And one of the things I'll offer, just as an idea for us, is maybe it's because we're not thinking different. And I love that quotation from the Apple ads, with Steve Jobs narrating, here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the round pegs and the square holes, the people who think different, they are the change makers. And Andrew, I don't know if I have any tactical ideas on how to do that, but I will say I've been really trying, and my colleagues get out of our elements. We try and learn about other industries. I'm taking a week in March and attending a deep dive at Stanford's Design Thinking School just to learn how other people in other industries do this type of innovative thinking. I feel like just learning differently helps us. And the last thing I'll say there is I actually got into transportation professionally, just kind of luck. My first client when I was a lawyer was 3M, the manufacturing company out of Minnesota. And they, among other things, among Post-its, they manufacture road signs, pavement markings. So I had to learn a lot about this. And at 3M, they have what's called 10% time, meaning you are encouraged 10% of your day, week, month, year, do something completely different. Attend a conference like this, go take a class, go for a walk, go skydiving, just do something different because that spurs innovation and new ideas.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we have the time for audience questions if there are. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions, but I wanted to give an opportunity to the audience. And I think we have mics on either side, or maybe we can pass them over. Yeah, I think that's going to be logistically the easiest way to do this. And I love the fact that you emphasized speaking in plain language, take out jargon, and we try to emphasize that to our students as well, that if you're going to have your work legible and people actually be inspired, you need to cut out the jargon. Yeah, so I appreciate that.
Good morning. I'm Leanne Chung from sunny Sarasota, Florida, proud alumna of the Columbia Civil Engineering Department. So I just bought a new car about 2 weeks ago, brand new technology. It's a Genesis GV70, so it's an SUV, and I have my cell phone. And I have to navigate all over Tampa Bay area to go to job sites that don't have buildings yet, don't have addresses. I'm inspecting the job sites. The funny thing is, I'm using the Google Maps, and that technology is better than my brand new car. My car has this brand new navigation touchscreen I've never had, okay? I'm wondering, it's the same streets. And locally, I kind of have a gut feel on there's so much tourism right now. There's so many people in Florida. So I kind of have a gut feeling too, I shouldn't be going down the street. So how come there's the car is not navigating that well? It is not taking me to, I think, better routes, my opinion. So, but then locally, we have a hunch too. We need to avoid this area to get to the airport. So technology, 2 different devices in the same area. What's your opinion about that? And thank you for having this. I'm literally doing the 10%, flying up here just for this. I literally, Dean, they invited me and I flew up for this, so thank you.
Oh my gosh, practicing what we preach. I love this so much. Oh
So
my gosh,
thank you.
well, such a pleasure to meet you and great question. And I will say, so about 12 years ago when I started to move towards the transportation technology space on the automotive side, I realized exactly what you referenced is still happening today. There were all these conversations at TRB and transportation conferences and transportation industry associations about technology and innovation. And then there were all these conversations at automotive conferences and automotive trade associations and automotive events about technology and innovation. And guess what's happening? They're not always talking. I will say, in the last several years, especially since generative AI has really started to transform innovation, we're trying to bridge that gap. The Auto Alliance, which represents OEMs, is now trying to talk to, CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, where Google's a member of, or like ITS America, but we have to help them bridge those gaps. I applaud you bringing that up, and I'm hoping someday we solve that.
I had a little bit of a similar question, basically about the length and breadth of Google satellites. So suppose I had a 2026 car registered to me, and I drove from New York to California. Is there anything Google can't tell me about my trip?
It all comes down to privacy, right? Google has a lot of information. We have several different means of data, right? We have Waze. People choose to put information into Waze. Cities can participate in that. We have Android Auto. We have the general maps feature where when you're turning it on, you can opt in to share that information. But you asked about some of the fundamental principles, Andrew. Privacy is so fundamental to companies like Google and some of our sister companies in the private sector that we have to balance information with privacy. A good example is I come from rural America. I didn't actually even know until I was 20 that public transportation existed. I had to learn how to drive. If I were to go into Google Maps, I cannot locate a lot of data on the rural roads in the Midwest because so few people drive them so infrequently that we would immediately, or a third party would be able to identify, that's Kristin's dad. Well, my dad doesn't drive. That's Kristin driving along that road. And we cannot have that. So honestly, like, it's maybe up to academia and researchers to help us bridge those fundamental, that's a values conversation. Information, safety, privacy protection, we haven't solved that yet.
We're working on exactly that. So I think with that, I think we're probably on time. So we'll be around after to chat. But I think if we could thank Kristin again very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. So we're on to our first